Thank you, Professor Clive Kessler. Okay, so we have got a lot of interesting points being mentioned by our previous speakers. Of course, Professor Ebrahim Moosa, he talked a lot on the whole situation and problems related to the Muslim global world. And Professor Rashila, she talked about the problem of Islamophobia. And Professor Clive Kessler mainly talked about the problem relates to the Palestine and Israel situation. So now is the time for discussion, comments or questions. Because of the consideration of time, I would like to open questions first, meaning that anyone who have questions, please raise your hands and please proceed to the mic. If we have extra time, I will open for another round of questions. But if we may not have the extra time, we may just end with one session. So one question time. So anyone else with a question?
My very first short comment was you mentioned about lack of dignity despite wealth. In my opinion, especially as far as Saudis are concerned, is the very fact that wealth from oil that has made them very arrogant and undignified. And the second thing about the lamenting of education, yes, I really agree with you that we do not, in fact, sometimes I feel that in this country we discourage thinking. It's just teaching people without making them think. And the third thing is, besides the lack of imagination, I think it is also ignorance, and more so, which I think both Rashila and Clive made a point later on, is politics. People use this, to really, for the political ends. And finally, for Professor Ebrahim, is you were a little not so optimistic about Rashid Ghanouchi's model in Tunisia. Maybe you have reason to be so. But I feel that they are in a much, much better position, and I'm more optimistic for Tunisia as compared to Malaysia for only one reason. They are homogeneous. It's a homogeneous Muslim society. We are multicultural. Rashila, I really like your comment about something about the three Hanifi or Abrahamic faiths to look at their similarities and their values. But I think it is easier said than done, because every time we highlight our differences, not our similarities. And that is very, very saddening. And again, the reason is politics. It's all politics. And that brings me to Clive's comment and how. Clive, I don't want to really quarrel with you, but I think we cannot deny the fact that it's the millions and millions that Rothschild had that made Lord Balfour made that declaration. I tend to I subscribe to that. I think that was the power of the Zionists in the form of money. And you mentioned about Islam has really made it seem as if Judaism should have been incorporated, embraced into Islam. And I'm still in the middle of reading Mustafa Akyol's The Islamic Jesus. He's put forward a very, very nice theory about how we have forgotten about the Jewish Christians. So we have the traditional Judaism, we have Christianity, which became Paul's Christianity, which is, and Paul never met Jesus to begin with. But in between, there was this Jewish Christianity that the Gospel of Barnabas has really made very clear. So if you look at the Gospel of Barnabas, that is really in line with what Muslims believe as far as the end of, or the crucifixion of Jesus is concerned. But my point is that if we believe in what Mustafa Akyol has written, which I tend to believe, that really the Muslims should stop thinking about Judaism has been incorporated into Islam as they understand it today. It was more towards having that Jewish Christianity in between. And finally, I'm sorry to take so much time, about the definition of Al-Aqsa. I too, being a Muslim, would like to believe what my Ustad tells me, but I too, being a thinker and a person of logic, would like to find more historical evidence that actually the definition of Al-Aqsa, is it the whole 36 acres or is it just the Qibli Mosque and the surrounding area? So I wish I can disagree with you, but I will not, because I think there is not enough historical evidence.
Assalamualaikum and good evening, Prof. Ebrahim and the panelists. My name is Muziro, and I want to give a question to Prof. Ebrahim. When you talk about theology of empire, it reminds me of classical books written by classical ulama, such as Al-Mawardi or Al-Alfasi, that used to put the idea of supremacy Muslims in their political books, such as Al-Ahkam, Al-Sultaniyah, and Siyasatnameh. And that idea is also very common in another classical text on Islamic politics. So, what is your opinion if I say that among the cause of the emergence of radical Muslims today also come from these texts that are considered primary texts for Muslims today, besides the misinterpretation of religion?
Good evening, my name is Adriana. My question is to Professor Ebrahim. Professor Ebrahim, I've enjoyed your discussion. Basically, it's very practical. What I picked up was creative education, no handout. Creative education, no handouts, and you were asking about GDP just now. We have all those issues in this country. Basically, I'm a product of not really creative education. We have education here. Our literacy level is rather high. GDP, maybe on a national level, we were there once upon a time, but on individual or household, it's not there. The only thing is the handouts. We have policies in place in this country, basically, and I'm also a product of it. Put simply, handout policy. You were stressing more about going back into education, creative education, basically how to improve life, the soul, going back to akhlaq and adab. The thing is, despite the fact that this country of mine has been having policies in place to help my race, basically, to improve themselves, it's just nowhere that our forefathers envisioned when we actually created this country. How do we go about creating an education for people to return back, to gain back dignity, to empower themselves when we are struggling with policies in place, or people who want to maintain handout policies for their own gains? You know, how do we, well, not to be so brazen, how do we introduce that, basically? We have education in this country, but it's lip service, basically. Thanks.
Okay, so there are three, I won't just say questions, but also comments given by, first of all, Dr. Narima, quite a number of questions and comments as well. And then Muziru asked mainly about the Sultan, sorry, I can't remember the book. Al-Ahkam al-Sultaniyah, yeah, it's a very important classical text on Islam and politics. And Adriana mainly asked about education. So I would like to first invite Professor Ebrahim Moosa to respond to the comments and questions, and then to Professor Rashila, and then later to Prof. Clive Kessler.
Thank you. Thank you to all the questioners, and I'll try my best. Some of these questions are fairly, I'm going to try and keep it as brief as possible. Let me start with Adriana's question and your comment about, you know, how to alter the conditions under which you're living and the unhappy nature of that. That, you know, you need to get rid of the politicians who do the very things that you find to be antithetical through the ballot box. Not the bullet, the ballot box. Okay? You have to use the ballot box, you need to organize, you need to mobilize, and you need to get in people there who are going to do things differently. I mean, look at India and look at how, you know, Aam Aadmi took over Delhi. You know, it's an alternative kind of politics. So this can be done. Don't think that politics can only be done through connecting to the aristocratic political rulers, or, you know, being part of a huge amount of money to get into that. So you need to organize. To get the alternatives, you have to organize, you have to go door to door, you have to work hard to get that and persuade people. Politics is about persuasion, and it's about communication, and it's about changing, and then you can get the opportunity to change the rules of the game. So it's only through the political that you can improve the lives of people. I mean, you can also, I mean, I was thinking when Professor Rashila was speaking about, you know, what is the way forward through the question of Islamophobia. I've written something on kind of the politics of reconciliation in an age of empire. And I've argued there that, you know, a couple of things that one ought to be doing. One is to create, you know, people-to-people dialogue across political and political divisions, because, you know, those people in power are preventing people to talk to each other across different cultural and civilizational boundaries. And the second thing that I would say at the global level is that there must be a politics of accountability, okay? And I would say that, you know, if I come to the question that was raised by Dr. Narima about the question of kind of recognition of Israel and so on, I mean, what we haven't heard is, you know, what is the politics of accountability? Both the Arabs who engaged in a war and lost territory have to be held accountable, and Israel's land grabbing and land stealing need to be held accountable. We cannot have a real conversation about that. As the problems of Islamic politics, which is the real theme of today's conversation, is that, you know, Muslim thinking on the political has to make the major move and transition away from a theology of empire to a theology of human dignity, and a theology that takes human dignity seriously. Politics cannot be metaphysics. And unfortunately, the politics of the Middle East, especially about Israel and Jerusalem and all that, have been taken into the realm of metaphysics. So these are political issues that has to be negotiated between sane individuals and sane communities. And there's insanity prevailing in that part of the world. And I think the Zionists from time to time, and sometimes the Palestinians. I mean, I gave a talk at a mosque in a country, in a place in North America, I'm not going to identify it, and I said that the question of suicide bombing that was, you know, invented by Hezbollah and then taken up by Hamas and others have been seriously detrimental to not only Muslim image, but detrimental to Islamic ethics. And I said how this violates dignity and so on. And, you know, the Palestinians in the mosque were upset. I had a long meeting with the imam for 3 hours. At the end of 3 hours, the imam still says Muslims are doing this because they've been oppressed. Muslims are doing suicide because they're oppressed. The answer to oppression is not suicide bombing, idiot. The answer to oppression is to have better alternatives. And as if suicide bombing creates alternatives. Suicide bombing has not regained for Palestinians an inch of the property they lost. Not an inch. But neither is the Israeli government's duplicity on a whole range of things helpful in any conversation, and setting up Trump, or whatever Trump has done to all this kind of stuff, which is completely, you know, rejected by the world community, and thankfully, and I think enough people some amount of people in the United States. But nevertheless, these issues cannot be raised to the level of metaphysics. There are historical records, there are conversations that ought to be had, but that cannot be. Dr. Narima, I'm not pessimistic about Tunisia. I actually said that Tunisia has a better leadership core, in my view, compared to Egypt. The Brotherhood were just so hungry for power, they grabbed it, they didn't have no imagination. Ghannouchi is a philosophical thinker who understands political power. I know him fairly well. In the 90s, I spent 2 weeks with him when he was in exile, and he visited South Africa. And we had extended conversations about some of these issues. And he understands. Now, some of these moves are tactical, some of these moves are strategic and political, but he knows that, you know, Sharia implementation in Tunisia is not going to work neither for the secular nor for those people who want it. And he knows the era after era. So I can't say I'm very optimistic, but I think if they keep it together, they can come out to a different destination if the powers in the region are going to allow them to do so. And maybe, you know, they should not have overreach. And as I said, in today's politics, you need to see what is reachable, what is doable. No, I don't think Tunisia is homogeneous. They're ethnically homogeneous, but not ideologically. There are people who are dead against, the Renaissance Party. They think the Renaissance Party is a danger and is going to bring in Islamism. I mean, I remember on the day, on the months leading up to Ghannouchi returning, I met a young Tunisian student at the American University of Beirut, and he told me, terrible. I said, what happened? He said, Ghannouchi arrived, and the people were singing the same songs to him in Arabic the same songs, the one when the Prophet came to Medina, Tala al-Badru alayna, you know, that the moon has shone upon us. And he said, what the heck is going on? Why is Ghannouchi allowing himself to turning into a charismatic figure like this? And so it is quite clear that Tunisians are divided. So homogeneous ethnically maybe, but ideologically there are multiple divisions, and it requires wide statecraft, and it requires wide leadership to bring people together to what is the common good. So, I mean, maybe we can have a conversation what you mean by homogeneity, but I think politically they are very divided. Tunisia has been a very secular country, but despite being a secular country, it's also one of those countries that all polls show very disturbing signs that, for instance, Tunisians want blasphemers to be punished severely. You need to look at some of the Pew polling stuff. So, I mean, there are 3,000, yesterday we had a conversation here by a Tunisian professor who teaches at International Islamic University, who said there are about 3,000 Tunisians who've become jihadis, and they're going to come back, and one of the largest exporters of jihadis in the region. And where does that come from? So we need to be open-eyed and be realists about some of these issues. The question about, Muslim attitude to Judaism, let me just be clear, it's appalling. Muslims' attitude to Jews is appalling, but I also don't agree with Professor Kessler when he says that the Muslim theology is to incorporate Judaism. Muslim theology developed out of political contingencies. So when Islam became top dog, of course it became hegemonic, and then theology takes a hegemonic form. But this theology can change, and it ought to change. It's no longer acceptable to peddle the what's name of the protocols of Zion, and to and to say horrific things about Jews and financial things. I mean, one of your prime ministers said that many years ago. This terrible stuff. I mean, and do you think that if you say that about Jews, people are not going to say their things about Muslims? I mean, she gave a whole lecture about Islamophobia, precisely the same thing that many Muslims do about Jews, others do about Muslims. So this thing cuts both ways, and we need to sober up. There's no way of demonizing people for metaphysical and other kinds of historic reasons. If there's Palestinians experiencing historic injustice, then we need to expose the injustices. But there's, as Edward Said told me, there's no point fighting against Zionism and saying Zionism is different from Judaism. How does that win the battle? Zionism is a political development of the Jewish people about what happened to them in Europe. They develop an ideology, they organize themselves in a particular way, the same way that Islam has organized themselves globally. I mean, this is kind of Islamic Zion that we have. Oh, what is Pakistan? It's a kind of Islamic Zion. So this idea of nationalism and creating a national homeland on the basis of Islam is not unique to the Jews. Also unique, I mean, some people can argue that in Malaysia you have a certain kind of Muslim Zion, certain privileges for Bhumi Putras. It's the same idea that privileging them above others. And these are the same kind of logic that prevails. Now that doesn't work. I mean, that's what Palestinians will tell you, the kind of privileges Jews get that Israeli citizens of Palestinian background in theory might have but do not enjoy, right? So these issues are much more complicated. We need to be sober when we discuss these issues, and it requires self-criticism too. I think what we need to accept is that Jews and Christians, Jews and Muslims don't accept Jesus as a divinity. I mean, but Christians do. Now, whether that's a product of Christian theology through the various councils that the way Christians understood it, but that is their teaching. We might disagree theologically, but we cannot disrespect them for their point of view. What you do is you keep on talking and talk about the disagreement. At some point, Christians are not going to change their view, Muslims are not going to change their view, so be smart and talk about the common good. Because there's no way that you're going to make Christians believe, otherwise in this question. And so the Gospel of Barnabas is not seen as a canonical gospel. The Gospel of Barnabas is not seen as a canonical gospel by Christians. It is seen as a marginal one. It's like trying to tell Muslims that the satanic verses is part of the Quran. Right? So I think these issues require a much more longer conversation. And what's the name? Muziro's question about the question. Look, These documents and these writings are historical archives. They are not actionable. And anybody who tries to make them actionable in terms of ready-made blueprints need to have their minds read. Need to have their minds read. Muslims historically, even the Quran and the Hadith, Muslim theologians and scholars don't just implement the verses, they think about those issues in terms of the world in which those verses were revealed, how they understand that. Yesterday I spoke myself, hopefully not blue in the face, but I tried my best, and maybe I didn't succeed, is to try and say that Muslims understood these issues in terms of a framework of knowledge, a very thick framework of knowledge, a framework of knowledge that connects to the reality. That becomes the framing question. And therefore your texts and your histories are interpreted and through this framework, and that framework we call tradition. This framework we call tradition is handed out. One generation hands over to the next generation a framework of knowledge that is better than the one that they've been handed. And that means that you have to update the framework of knowledge. And therefore some things that might have been part of the past are no longer workable in the present. But the unfortunate situation is that Muslim tradition has been in a state of breakdown for at least 3 to 4 centuries. Furthermore, the colonial and other kinds of things have not helped. But that is the hand that we were dealt with, and now you need to go forward. And the way going forward is not to reimagine the past and try to implement the past in the present, but it's a way of thinking about what is your reality. And therefore, this question of tradition and the thickness of tradition and the relevance of knowledge for tradition, and to abandon the theologies of empire and the theologies of dominance and the theology of privilege to a different kind of theology that thinks about human dignity as a centerpiece of that. And that is what ought to be what groups like IRF and others, why I communicate and stay in touch with these groups and other organizations around the world, because this is the worthwhile thing to do. This is the conversation that ought to be had. But also, what I'm doing right now with colleagues around in India and Pakistan, we're taking, and hopefully we can open up a portal for Southeast Asia, is to take religious scholars, ulama, and put them through online program, put them through a deepening of their theological and scientific literacy. And I must tell you, we've been doing this for 18 months, and there's amazing, small group of people, recently graduated ulama from India and Pakistan. We educate them online, bring them together for winter and summer programs, 1 week in the winter, 2 weeks in the summer, and opening up their horizons and having these conversations. Not telling them what to think, but making them understand what is the present and how to begin to think about the past. And therefore, when most Muslims think that today's Muslims must look exactly the way Muslims in the past look, that is not true. We are different is difference without negation. You understand yourself today as different, but without negating and making judgments on the past. You cannot make judgments of the past. But some of the things of the past are just no longer workable in the present, such as slavery. And our biggest problem is, maybe several problems, but at least one of the big problems is that those people who are the keepers of Islamic orthodoxy are possibly creating the groundwork for real horrible things. And they have authority, and they have power, and they're creating things that in a way that they have not rethought those issues. So Islamic reform that I talked about yesterday has, in many ways, Islamic reform has failed, because the real target audience has not been addressed and has not worked with this. And political Islam has sprung up with a lot of anger and a lot of ambition and idealism, but greater disaster. So the crisis of Islamic civilization is the crisis of the imagination. The crisis of imagination. And that means that spirituality should be at the centerpiece, dignity should be at the centerpiece, and the humanity of all human beings is vital for both for Muslims and for their own sake. Not because they are Jews or Christians or Hindus or Buddhists or whatever the case may be, but for humanity's own sake. Thank you.
I think there was not really much of a question for me, but thank you, Dr. Narima, for stating that, it is necessary to look into the traditions and the culture, especially the roots of it that we share in common. Yeah, the problem is too much emphasis is being put on the politics of difference. And that has caused a lot of conflict, that has caused a lot of misinterpretation, misjudgment of one another, whether it is between communities or even worse of all, within the same community. They cause a lot of problems. So this is what we're facing. And yeah, election is coming up. I think everybody is already thinking about it, or been thinking about it for a long time. So the idea is that this is the time to put in competent leaders, however we define our competent leaders. So this is an opportunity that we should not let go. So how we get organized, whether it is online or offline or whatever it might be, this is something that we really need to look into. So the idea of looking for commonalities is just as important and shouldn't be put aside. And the last comment would be actually on education itself. Yeah, I think we just need to take education into our own hands. At one point, we may not have the resources and so on, but because of the availability of information, the resources, I think that is where we can actually take it into our own hands. There are a lot of homeschooling now because people do not want to go to the public schools. Yes, you know, and there are different forms of education, so I think these are things that need to be looked into. Thank you.
You will. A brief response to Dr. Narima, but first I have to say I do endorse wholeheartedly, I think virtually everything that Professor Ebrahim Moosa says. I don't know whether we could be sober, but we can at least have a sane and amicable and constructive conversation about these things. Here you can fault the Rothschilds. I'm not sure how much they did, but one thing they did was to establish one of the early settlements that has very nice vineyards outside of Haifa, and if truth is to be found in wine, as they say, then there may be some truth to be had there. But what else is true about the Rothschilds, I won't go into at the moment. Let me say this. I think Ibrahim Moosa said, the Injil Barnabas is one of a very, very large number of documents, so-called Gnostic Gospels, Nag Hammadi manuscripts and so on, that come from the Middle East at the time of when, in post-biblical times, when, and also the Dead Sea Scrolls are there, and some of these documents, some of these Gospels and documents became canonical for Judaism and for Christianity, which has a different textual theological basis than does Islam, in which it is simply and exclusively the Quran. Everything else is commentary upon, elaboration upon, explication of. But now, in that sense, it is quite okay for people, and I used to run into people in Kelantan in the 1960s to say, yes, but you haven't read the Injil Barnabas, and if you only read that, you would have a different view of the matter. Look, if people, including Mustafa Akol, want to look at that, that is fine. They can look at it, they can see the historical evolution as they see it on the basis of the evidence that seems relevant to them, and including this. But the question is that Jews and Christians do not see those texts in that way. And so it's not relevant, and you can't decide the issue for them. So if you're going to get into some kind of a conversation, you have to get into the conversation with who they are and how they understand where they are and where they came from on the basis of their understanding of their own sacred and textual history. I mean, we have already, I don't want to be too critical, but in this country and others, there is a growth industry of interfaith dialogues in which people have dialogues with other faiths as they imagine and construct them. And they find representatives to it. You can't proceed in that way. Ultimately, the only way forward is a larger approach, of which I tried to suggest only one small instance today, namely Jerusalem. That you have to work out ways of sharing the world together. It has to be negotiated, in which you don't go and say, we'll negotiate, but I'll tell you what the basis of your negotiating You can't say, oh yes, under Islam or Judaism or Hottentotism, whatever you want to call it, there is a place for you in our world and we will tell you what it is. Because we know better than you do who you are and what your sacred texts are telling you. That's you know, you can do that. It just gets nowhere. And if I'm allowed to make a comment, I fear, if I'm allowed to make a further controversial comment, I fear that so much of the agenda and the activities of the movement for global moderates is in fact a vast enterprise to conduct dialogues with imagined and constructive representatives of communities whose real living members people can't deal with and cope with. And that's why I feel it is likely to come to grief. I will leave it at that and pass on to others.
Okay, so I'm going to open for another round of questions. Please make it brief. Please state your name, yourself.
So basically about Professor Clive's comments, closing comment, a question of civilization or a night of barbarism. A question of civilization or a night of barbarism. A night of barbarism. So I thought this was very poetic, but I think it's very unfair if this is associated with Islam as we know it. Professor Ebrahim Moosa had a quote which sort of reflects deeply the nature of Islam or the deen as we understand, as we Muslims practice. When Prophet said, how dare anybody would compare the value of Kaaba with the value of human being. So that relates to the definition of Al-Aqsa, which is also, to me, it sometimes is losing the purpose or is defeating the purpose of what we are doing and why we are discussing so much the sacredness of that place and so on, while people are being tortured and people are, citizens of that land are actually being, assassinated on a daily basis. So we would expect intellectuals and we would expect peoples of peace mission to discuss more about the value of human beings rather than the value of temples and the value of sacred lands and how that relates to the global politics. So one more comment about this question of civilization or the night of barbarism. I agree that we Muslims sometimes are not very interested or not very enthusiastic about reading and knowing more about our history. That's sometimes saddening. In fact, we should know more and we should learn more and we should appreciate ourselves more. But I think the same question goes to everybody, non-Muslims, especially Europeans and Western people, who also fail to read and understand their history, and especially when that history deals with this exact same question about choosing the road or the path to civility or choosing the path to barbarism. A few days ago, I've gone through a few documentaries about World War I and World War II, and I learned a few facts which was very surprising to me, such as when the key figure on German side for World War I, General Ludendorff, has actually facilitated the movement of Lenin to Russia to basically montage the October Revolution in order to close or to block the Russian side of the front. So it was a political game, but we, people all over the world, and I come from an ex-communist country, we thought that it was a battle of ideas and it was a sort of, a dreamland of ideologies and, humanity choosing the right side of economic, welfare and stuff like that. So it was just a few key figures playing the game, just like what is happening with ISIS today. So the Stalin, who was actually the arch enemy of Hitler by the end of the World War II, I was surprisingly finding out that was the best comrade of Hitler at the beginning of World War II. So how is this history being learned by Muslim or non-Muslim people everywhere, and how is this history nothing to do with Islam and the way that we today portray in sort of civilizational crises or in sort of, threats all over the world. So this is just an example how millions of people died in World War II, simply because of a few key figures playing their games. West and East, Russia, English, Britain, US involved later, and so on. So this is a comment for Professor Clive. I would appreciate your response. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Julia. I cannot disagree with Elma, who raised a very important issue here. I see that sometimes, very often actually, not sometimes, Muslims are being caught in some kind of romance. Muslims and people in general, like in the case of the Russian Revolution, which it's exactly the truth that it was sponsored by, not only by Germans, but also by some elite living abroad at that time, some Russian elite living abroad and sponsoring this revolution. And we are looking at it as some kind of romantic view, while it is almost always about the interests and how politics is made. I wanted to ask something from Dr. Ebrahim Moosa, something closer to our today's topic, because I feel we still keep walking around some abstract concepts, not leading to some point, or maybe not talking about the action, which I think we should talk about when we talk about global politics. And to get away a little bit from this romanticism, yesterday we talked about how Islam is being manipulated in national and local levels. Today we are supposed to talk about it in the global context. So we all know, but probably some disagree, global example of manipulation with Islam at the global level, which is a matter of Hajj. We have a king of Saudi Arabia, and I'm risking to be very unpopular, as Prof. Clive Kessler also mentioned earlier. We have a king of Saudi Arabia which calls himself as a custodian of 2 holy mosques. And year by year, we have millions of Muslims agreeing with this concept by performing Hajj. When I raise the issue about that, possibly we should think even out of national level, but at the global level, that Muslims should take some kind of coordinated action and possibly ban or boycott going to Hajj for a number of years. Stop providing the money and stop providing and supporting the authority of Saudi Arabia as a custodian, as a guardian of 2 holy places. My question, beside of making a point, was about that Dr. Ebrahim Moosa, you travel a lot and you communicate a lot with the Muslim communities in various countries. I know that in many Muslim communities, this idea would be perceived as heresy, as a Shia heresy. But have you ever noticed Muslims even discussing the possibility of reviewing the status of Mecca and Medina, and how it could be given international status, and what Muslims could do to withdraw this authority from the single power, which we know that many, I'm so sorry for taking that long, which we know that many Muslim countries, many Muslim majority countries, they depend on the Hajj quota because they need to respond before their population which wants to go to Hajj, and Saudi Arabia perfectly knows it, and that's why those countries are trying to keep their relationship with Saudi Arabia intact. So have you ever noticed these ideas even taking a little traction in some Muslim communities? Thank you.
Thank you, Robert Fu here. I think this I've been attending a lot of these forums. Definitely this is one of the forums where I hear very honest opinions about taking responsibility, identifying the problems, and really trying to see. Oh, sorry. Oh, louder.
Maybe you can just.
I wanted to say something and run away, but but basically, I think Professor Moosa. Okay, sorry. Yeah, from the talk and the sharing that you shared yesterday, and also the session that we had together at the tea time, and also today's session especially. This is the first time I've heard a person who's basically a Muslim and an intellectual being very honest in terms of taking responsibility of where the Muslim position is, one of the first, okay? And you are very articulate, and I think that is very good, and that is definitely a very good start. But I find that sometimes this kind of discussions is so intellectual. I wonder what happens to the guys outside there, whether they actually talk this kind of language. Probably they won't. So my question is very short. What I see, the kind of Islam that's being practiced outside, is the kind of identity politics Islam that we see, okay? The kind of Islam, as I mentioned to you yesterday, that like some people, you're talking about wanting to have a Louis Vuitton bag. You know, you cannot afford it, it's so expensive, and it's a collector's item. So what people do is they go to Thailand and buy one. But then they parade themselves all over the place and say, oh, I got this wonderful bag, and they get a sense of, the kind of fake branding, you know, the kind of Islam. And that is very sad, unfortunately, but that is the kind of identity politics I see. So my question is very short. How do we, okay, as Muslims or non-Muslims, as basic humans, handle situations of identity politics, not only in Islam, but also in many other situations, but particularly in Malaysia, because Islam is a very dominant narrative now. That is why I come and ask this question. For Islam, how do we, at the local level, at the non-intellectual level, so to speak, handle issues of identity politics? I'm not saying that you have an answer because it is a very complex question, but what are your thoughts? Thank you.
I think I begin by responding to Julie. I think, look, I was not referring to Islam as barbarism. I was stating quite clearly that any ISIS-Daesh type agenda or any Hizb ut-Tahrir type agenda that assumes the imposition of an Islamic world order, even if it's of a soft cell type, one that slides into rather than involves a headlong embrace of that agenda, threatens me, raises for me the spectre of a nighttime of barbarism. And anybody who, well, that's how we see I don't see how anybody can see the lessons that Daesh has taught us any other way. And I simply see agendas like Hizb ut-Tahrir or other kinds of, let's establish a new caliphate or a global Islamic world order as being the statements of that at the theoretical level without the full, without being explicit about the violent means by which it is likely to be imposed. Beyond that, Robert, I appreciate what you had to say, but I think it's really there are comments for Ebrahim Moosa to be complimented on his forthrightness. I would simply say, again, that I agree largely with what Ebrahim has said about many things to do with the Middle East. I'm certainly not in favour of vile land grabs and occupations. My own view of the Middle East is that two sides are playing a game, and that there is, people talk peace process. There is no peace process. The peace process, so far as the Palestinians are saying, concerned is, let people talk about peace process. We will sit around and do nothing, and talk to nothing and negotiate anything, even when negotiations and offers are made. And if we wait 200 years again, perhaps like the Crusaders, they'll go away. In response to which the Israelis are saying, well, look, you better get a move on, because the longer you delay it, the more land we'll start sitting on, and the harder it will be to negotiate. So you really ought to start negotiations sooner rather than later. That's the stupid game that's being played, and I personally don't have time for either. I do agree with Ibrahim Moosa about when he talked about what does suicide bombing achieve. I've said for years that if the Palestinians had been, in my sense, to my understanding, shrewd enough to conduct a Gandhian political campaign of non-violence, they would have had their state, they would have had their moral victory, and they would have had their political victory long before this. But there's a certain commitment not just to winning, but winning in a certain way that corresponds to a certain historical idea of struggle that is in effect causing more suffering than it's causing gain. Let me leave it at that.
Okay, I just have a very quick response. I'm just wondering, like 50 years from now, what would be the kind of history that is to be written about us? Yeah. Sometime back, actually, I had a conversation with my mom, who is 82 now, and she was telling me that, when she was studying history, it was actually about Queen Elizabeth. It was really the European history. Yeah. And then later on, in terms of our own curriculum, I was doing Frank Swettenham and a little bit of Panglima Awang. And that shift. So the point is that history, it depends on what the authority wants us to think. I mean, in terms of the curriculum. So this is something which is very, can be very frightening because of the fact that, our kids will not get proper pictures. Although at this point, as I said, because of the internet, you are able to access different points of view. But still, there are those who are actually not able to access, and they are getting this kind of curriculum. So we do need to be careful about what is being, the exposure in terms of education that we give to the next generation. Finally, one last thing would be just taking the point that Prof. Ebrahim said, to look Muslim and to do Muslim, also to say Muslim. What does that mean for each and every one of us? Because that can mean different things, and I think what is more important is really to do Muslim compared to the look Muslim. Thank you.
I want to thank my colleagues, Professor Clive, Kessler, Professor Rashila, and everybody else here for being here. I might not see all of you here again at the venue tomorrow. I'm speaking at Nottingham or Monash? Nottingham University. It's slightly different there. If you can or do come, and I look forward to having a further conversation. 3 comments as we close out the session. One is that I think there's a difference between conspiracy theories and skepticism. I think that it's a sense of powerlessness that many Muslims engage in conspiracy theories. 9/11 never happened. All this is a conspiracy, the creation of the State of Israel. So East Timor is also a conspiracy, and the division of India, Pakistan also conspiracy. That is meaning that you're not looking at history and as reality. The partition of the subcontinent happened because people wanted it so. Someone mentioned here that, what Indonesia was saying at the creation of, the creation of Malaysia and so on. So these are real events. Muslims need to steep themselves into history, but not conspiratorial understanding of history. And I think, Professor Rashila also mentioned it. So equip yourself with the different narratives of history. So that's different. So conspiracy theory is ultimately going to consume those who believe in it. Conspiracy theories normally consume those who believe in it. And it is undignified. It contradicts dignity because God has given you a mind, an intellect. وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ, that we have given dignity to the children of Adam. That dignity is because we have intellect, we are human beings, we think. Animals also think, but we think better than animals. At least that's what we know according to neuroscience. And we have a certain responsibility. To not think, as I said yesterday, to not think is to invite the banality of evil, as Hannah Arendt put it, right? When she talked about the banality of evil of Eichmann in Jerusalem, she later on thought, why did I use this phrase that evil can just be so ordinary, so simply? And she said that it is because the absence of thinking can result in a person saying, I was just doing my job. I was just being a Malaysian citizen. I was just doing my job. I was just going around with the flow. And so conspiracy theory is very different from skepticism. Skepticism is when you question when you question the question and you question the answers. And if you can't come up with answers, you're going to keep on saying, I'm thinking. But you don't come up with a grandiose, cockamamie answer and say, this is the answer. And you know, the smartest people can sit at a wedding or at a funeral and talk and say, let me explain to you what happened. And they put together a weirdest story and no one will tell them, can you just jump in the lake for this nonsense that you're speaking? But no one would say that. People would say, oh my God, this guy is so great. He's so fantastic. It is your duty to say, can you go and jump in? Look, get out of this place. I cannot stand you. You're talking absolute nonsense. And these are the answers to that. But we tolerate those people. And politicians do that on a regular basis. But your media people do that on the basis, on various stations and television, radio, and we don't say anything. We don't vote with our feet. And as I said, you know, when horror happens in your name, you may have to vote with your feet. The second thing is that I think Professor Clive and others already talked about this question about interfaith and how we do so. In these interfaith conversations, I mean, the way I get it also, often in the interfaith conversations, my Christian colleagues want to make me believe that I must believe in a personal God. And Muslims do not believe. For Christians, God thinks like us, laughs like us, smiles like us. You know, I don't know if he goes to bed, but you know, whatever God does, it resembles to what humans do. In Islam, God is very different. God is unlike us. We believe that la aynahu wa la ghayruhu. When God says he talks, it is neither not talking, it is neither like talking, nor is it talking. It's something quite mysterious. It's it's metaphorical. But this idea that people are shoving down a personal God in through my head, I have to resist that. And that is because that's no conversation. It's a belief that, you know, human rights and those kind of narratives will work better with an idea of a personal God. It doesn't work. Muslims and Jews in particular have had ideas of claims and duties and so on without believing in a personal God. Now some Jews have possibly now believe in a personal God, but Muslims don't. Sufis have also tried to introduce an understanding of God, that God is with us, but that God is also not with us, which is not a personal God. So oftentimes we have to be extremely careful about these ideas about personhood. Now personhood is now a secular concept which really means about your status as a person. But for Catholics, it means that it's connected with an idea of the nature of the divinity. Or for some Protestants too. But for Muslims, it's got to do with the status of a human being's dignity. Nothing to do with that our dignity, what the relationship of human dignity is to God's dignity. It remains a mysterium, but there's a relationality. But there's no one-on-one relationship to that. So that was on that front. On the question of conspiracy and the question of skepticism on interfaith and so on. Thirdly, I wanted to say that we have to think about what history do we want to write. What history do you want to write for yourself, and what history do you want to write for your community? Do you want to write a forgettable history of mediocrity, or do you want to write one of achievement, where the greatest of human good will be optimized and maximized? I think that's what every one of us around the world have to ask. Madam Alma has asked this question about, you know, I think Professor Clive explained that. But one of the things that I struggle with, that a small minority has hijacked Islam. And yet the vast majority are powerless. That to me it bothers me. Yes, we can reclaim and say things, but why did it take an alliance, an armada of military force to get rid of Daesh, who committed every unspeakable horror in the name of Islam? I don't have the answer to that, but we have to think about that. And the vast majority of Muslims are good, they want to live, they care for the Hindu, Buddhist neighbor, they marry each other, they do all this kind of stuff, and they care for each other. But why can't these very self-same people, these good Muslims, speak up? that not in our name? And why do we have, why do we have groupthink? Groupthink is dangerous. And so it bothers me. I possibly have the answer because Islamophobia puts Muslims pushes them against the wall. That they become, and I've already talked about, there is something called Muslim Zionism. That Muslims just go together and just team up against the rest. The world is against us, and we are going to now just go and work together and not care about the rest. There is a kind of Muslim nationalism emerging. Muslims can do no wrong. And some of the excesses of Zionism is also that Jews can do no wrong. You can't even criticize Judaism, any aspect of Israeli policy, then you are an anti-Semite. That is nonsense. That is absolute nonsense. But the same way, Muslims must be self-critical. And so there's an emergent kind of Muslim Zionism, that Muslim nationalism, that, Muslims can do no wrong. And so what has happened is that it's this idea of victimhood, that we are the victims, and we are now the world's biggest victims. And this victimization results into every kind of horror being committed. And some of my Zionist friends hate this victimhood, of Jewish victimhood, as a card that is playing over and over. Learn from Jewish history and you'll see what the things you shouldn't do. So I think that is something that we need to think about. The bad ideas in our midst, don't ban Hizb ut-Tahrir. Bring them out in the open and kill them with ideas. Make their ideas irrelevant. But that means, as Robert has asked, that progressives need to up their game. We need to be able to talk to lay people about the humanity of Islam to put them out of business. But banning them only gives them great hero status. And so I think what we need to do is a whole reschooling process. A reschooling process that begins right from, and as you mentioned, at dinner table. Right? You mentioned dinner table. It's the way you talk about your Hindu, Buddhist, Jewish, Christian, atheist neighbor at dinner time. They're atheists. It's a Jew. It's the Hindu. It's the Buddhist. That's where you create the attitudes that your children inhabit. It's how you talk at dinner time. Your attitudes. And you think other people don't talk about you? They are the Muslims? You don't think they talk like that? They do. And therefore there's Islamophobia. And therefore you become a hated community. It's about conduct. At the bottom of it is about humane conduct. So the reschooling begins, and Islam, we believe that when you become an exemplary person yourself, then you have the capacity to repel evil with that which is beauty. Idfa' billati hiya ahsan. Repel evil with that which is beauty, with that which is beautiful. Then the one who is your enemy can become your bosom friend. And that is going to be, Robert, your question is, I'm hoping to write a book, a popular book, titled Repel Evil with Beauty, which comes out of a message of the Quran of how you have to conduct yourself on a global stage. Now, to Julia's question about, this question about the Hajj, maybe I should have answered that question before I answered the thing, is the question about, are there people who don't want to go for Hajj while Hajj is under Saudi control? Yes, I've met many people who think that, that them going for pilgrimage is just going to endorse the bad behavior of the House of Saud. But people might have different views on this issue, and I'm not going to take an absolutist position. Sometimes people want to go for religious fulfillment, and you don't have to politicize the issue. Yes, their coffers are being filled, but their coffers are being filled even without the Hajj income, okay? And you're never going to persuade millions of Muslims not to go for Hajj. So I think progressives have to fight a battle that is winnable. Maybe one Hajj is enough, not 10 Hajjs, okay? So go for Hajj once in a lifetime, which is enough. And you don't have to go for Umrah twice a year. So be with that. Even Iran, that sees Saudi Arabia to be its vital and enemy in the region, antithetical to itself, even they can't stop their pilgrims from going to pilgrimage. Although Khomeini in 1 year stopped and said, the Wali Faqih can stop people from going to pilgrimage even if it's necessary, and 1 year they said it, and I think the year before last, pardon me? Yeah, but they did about 10 times, but they went for the last 20 years from the Islamic Revolution. They've been going on a regular basis. So even they can't stop it, okay? So yes, you can stop it, but you're going to stop. How are you going to get this consensus? So I would say that it is a sentiment that I can understand, but I don't think it's going to be very practical. The question is going to be, do we have how I think that the way to do this is to the Hajj question is an obligation on every Muslim. So even if Mecca was under the Romans or under any other kind of thing, you're still obliged to go there. So it's not a question under whose suzerainty it is. But politics, why don't you start with something much more practical here? Why don't you boycott some bad businesses or some bad politicians where you can have, on a local scale success? This is too big an issue to convince 1.5 billion Muslims not to go for pilgrimage. Because if 500,000 Malays are not going to go, that's not going to make any difference. If 2 million people stay away from Hajj, that's going to be a big difference to the Saudi coffers. But how are you going to do that? But choose a battle that you can win on a local basis, whether it's in Bosnia or whether it's in any other place, where you can have practical outcomes. So the way to go forward is through exemplary conduct, and that we need to translate this message into, because ultimately what makes us human is about the beauty we have within and the beauty that we do outside. And the Quran says very carefully, repel evil with that which is better. Better talent, better ability, better beauty, better efficiency, so that those who are your bosom enemies can be your best friends. Those who are not your lethal enemies become your bosom friends. But then it says, وَمَا يُلَقَّاهَا إِلَّا الَّذِينَ صَبَرُوا وَمَا يُلَقَّاهَا إِلَّا ذُو حَظٍّ عَظِيمٍ. That this capacity does not come to those who are prepared to go through a lot of hardship and those who have been given a great deal of fortune. Good fortune doesn't come automatically. You have to earn good fortune. The world and the cosmos can only smile on you when you make a contribution that makes this cosmos a better place and a better outcome and a better world. And that's when fortune comes your way. Fortune favors those who are prepared to take risks, and fortune favors the brave. Thank you.
I would like to call for a last round of applause to all our speakers. Definitely it was a fascinating and insightful discussion indeed. Okay, just before I end today, because we've been quite definitely quite late based on our earlier planned time. Tomorrow, as Professor Ebrahim Moosa mentioned, we are going to have another session with a very interesting topic indeed. Again, is on critical Islam, the depths and burden of critical Islam. Definitely a very interesting discussion indeed again. And definitely we are going to have some high tea food we want to have later after this. So I would like to invite others to join us again tomorrow, and look forward to see you all then. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.